Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, my name is Laura Vogt. I am the Curator of Education here at your National World War I Museum and Memorial. And on behalf of our President and CEO, Matt Naylor, and on behalf of our Board Chairman, Mark Jorgensen, I would like to welcome and thank you all for being here this evening. I'd also like to thank the partners that you will be hearing about shortly. They are such good friends of the museum, and it is a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and to be working with you all. Kansas City has been a community-minded and a civic-minded city since 1919. 2 weeks after the armistice, Kansas Cityans came together and they created a memorial for those who lived through and those who died during the World War. And it's Kansas Cityans who raised $2.5 million in 1920, roughly about $34 million in today's dollar. And it wasn't about a party line, it was a bipartisan effort to build this space that you are in today. Your nation's World War I Museum and Memorial, which hosts the most comprehensive collection of Great War artifacts in the world. And from its inception, it's been a meeting place for the community. And it's our very great pleasure and honor to be partnering with American Public Square this evening to host this very important conversation in today's world that finds its very deep roots in the past. Now, as part of our modern audience, I'd like to remind you of a couple of quick things. In a modern audience, most of you have these. So if you would go ahead and take these out and put them to silent or to vibrate, that would be wonderful. Also, you are going to be invited to use social media here in just a few moments. If you don't have good internet connection through your wireless provider, please go online to ours. You should all have some good access to internet, and feel free to follow us on Twitter at the WWI Museum. Now, as we are here amid the centennial commemorations of the First World War that are going on around the globe, I don't know if you have been to the north of this beautiful property. I think most of you have seen that great frieze with the guardian spirit. But if you haven't noticed it recently, let me tell you the inscription that the people of the past wanted those of us of the present to be thinking about. These have dared bear the torches of sacrifice and service. Their bodies return to dust, but their work liveth forevermore. Let us strive on to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight and taking part of that mission, to be a part of such an important conversation for our present and our future. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Barbara Bickle, the Interim Chancellor and Provost of the University of Missouri, Kansas City.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Laura. I am Barb Bickle. I serve as Provost and Interim Chancellor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and we are very proud to have American Public Square affiliated with UMKC and to support the informative and innovative programs that it brings to Kansas City. Who would have thought that 4 years ago, when ALLAN KATZ raised the idea of American Public Square and proposed maybe 4 or 5 programs a year, that by its 4th season, American Public Square would be presenting almost 24 programs and events and have attendance like this at a single event. American Public Square is an integral part of UMKC's outreach to the community, and as such, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. I would like particularly to welcome tonight's panelists and to thank you for joining us here in Kansas City. And I would also like to thank the sponsors of tonight's programs, Cyprian Simkowicz and Jerry White, the McLarney Family Foundation, and Denton's. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. I want to thank our host tonight, the National World War I Museum and Monument. It's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful facility. And American Public Square's partners tonight are KCPT, the Truman Library Institute, the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum, the National Archives Kansas City, and the Kansas City Star. Let's thank them. The Kansas City Star is live streaming tonight's program via their Facebook page at facebook.com/Kansas City Star. If you're not here tonight, you can still submit questions for our panel via the Star. We are also tweeting tonight at American Public Square, which is right there, #APSKC. American Public Square is a member organization and relies on the support of its members to bring you these programs. If you are an American Public Square member, please raise your hand. Great, let's applaud you. Thank you so much. If you'd like to become a member, please stop at the table in the lobby after the program. We have special gifts and prizes for those who sign up this evening. And now I would like to introduce ALLAN KATZ, tonight's moderator. ALLAN is a proud UMKC alum, a former U.S. ambassador to Portugal, a UMKC distinguished professor, and the founder of American Public Square. ALLAN.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the World War I National World War I Museum and Monument for hosting us tonight, and to tonight's sponsors and our partners. It was almost 3 years ago, actually, to the night that we held our first American Public Square event in the Kansas City Public Library. The attendance was 140 people. We seem to have grown a bit since then. Is there anyone here who was there that night? Raise your hand. Okay, beginning to look like all of us who were at Woodstock, but thank you very much. Anyway, but we wanted to start a conversation, is what we said at the time, as opposed to a confrontation, because we have plenty of confrontations that go on. And I think that we like to think that over the 3 years, we've grown in trying to create a safe place where these kinds of conversations can take place. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I want to go over some of the ground rules for American Public Square programs, which those of you who come to our programs all the time, you can stop listening for a little bit. You each received a playbill for tonight's program, and in the playbill, it's got information on our panelists, sponsors, and partners. It also has information about upcoming events and how to contact American Public Square via social media or to become a member, which is really important so that we can continue to do things like this. Inside your playbill, you're going to find a question and a fact-check sheet. I would show it to you if I had it here, and I know I do, but I can't find it. But someone hold one up who's got it. Okay, that's it. Okay. If you have a question or a fact check, and that means if you hear something up here or from someone else that you don't think is factually accurate, you write it down, you hold your hand up, and a volunteer will come and take it. And it will be given to our roving reporter if it's a question, or our fact checkers if it's not. And so, our roving reporter tonight is Nick Haynes of KCPT over here. The redoubtable Mr. Haynes is serving this capacity since we began, and he always adds not only humor but insight as we do this. We're also going to be having some questions for the first time at American Public Square because of our new partnership with the Kansas City Star, and we have Colleen Nelson and Mary Kate Mativier. Where are you all? I can't see where you are. If you can raise your hand up there on the upper right. Okay, thank you very much. And they're also going to be taking questions via Facebook. Chris LeBeau and Tom Burns over here are hardworking fact checkers. They will be looking at, if they hear something that they find out is not true, they're going to let me know. And if you all think there's something that isn't quite correct, because we believe that having not only a civil conversation but a fact-based conversation is something that really doesn't happen enough. So now let me introduce our panelists. First of all, Greg Orman is a successful businessman to the far left, I guess. No pun intended.
They're right.
Right. You're right. Well, right in the middle. Anyway, okay. A successful businessman and entrepreneur and the author of Declaration of Independence, that's spelled T-S, not C-E. Greg stood as an independent candidate for the United States Senate in Kansas in 2014, running against a three-term Republican incumbent. He currently runs Exemplar Holdings, a private company that actively manages a portfolio of businesses throughout the United States. Sitting next to him is my colleague, Beth Miller-VONNAHME, who is the chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She teaches courses on American politics, interest groups, public opinion, political campaigns, and voting behavior, and has to run meetings in which I am a member. Her published work explores how voters process and use certain types of campaign information, such as scandal involvement, physical characteristics like weight, to evaluate political candidates. Danny Diaz, sitting next to her, is a founding partner of FP1 Strategies, specializing in political and issue-based campaigns. Danny has worked at the highest levels in national political campaigns, recently serving as campaign manager for former Florida Governor Jeb Bush's presidential campaign. In 2008, Danny was the communications director of the Republican National Committee and also served as deputy communications director for John McCain in 2008 and deputy communications director at the RNC. Sitting next to Dan is Jackie SALIT, who has been active in the independent movement and an independent campaign since the 80s and is the president of independentvoting.org, a nonprofit strategy center and organizing hub. Jackie managed Michael Bloomberg's 3 campaigns for New York City mayor on her role on the Independence Party line, and in 2008, her network of independent supporters galvanized support for Barack Obama in the open Democratic primaries. Jackie's firsthand account of the growing independent movement, Independence Rising, Outsider Movements, Third Parties, and the Struggle for a Post-Partisan America, was published in 2012. And to my immediate left is an old friend, Howard Dean, who served as governor of Vermont for 6 terms and was chair of the Democratic National Committee from 2005 to 2009. As chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Howard created and implemented the 50-state strategy. A physician, Howard is an MSNBC contributor and a strategic consultant for Denton's, an international law firm, one of our sponsors tonight. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panelists. Now, the one item I neglected to say is that should be the last time we applaud until the program's over. We are not looking to encourage people to give red meat lines that will get applause. So if you vigorously agree with what you hear up here, I suggest you go like this. And if you disagree, just go like that. And then I think we'll have a really interesting evening. So, with all of that intro, we're now ready to go. I have a question I'm going to sort of throw out there. And actually, I'm going to start with you, Greg. And with both Democratic and Republican leaners, according to the polling that just came out of the Pew study in July of this year, over half of Democrat leaners, in other words, they don't identify with the party, but they lean that way, and over half of Republicans who are not actually Republicans but lean that way, over half of them do it because they don't like the other party. Is that the opening for an independent to run for office this year?
Well, I think that's a great point, and I think what you're pointing out here is that there's broad dissatisfaction with the two-party system in America today. 49% of Republicans say they wish there were a third party. 52% of Democrats say they wish there were a third party. So I really do think that there is significant dissatisfaction right now. We saw it in the last election cycle. In 2016, both Democrats and Republicans really gravitated to what we would normally consider to be unconventional choices. And I think there are lots of reasons why people are unsettled, frustrated, angry. But it's clear in my mind that people are looking for an alternative.
Well, Danny, do you think this campaign, everyone harkens back to 2016 campaign. Was this so anomalous in that you had the 2 very unpopular candidates and therefore sort of a little blip? Or do you think this is a movement that sort of is going to gain steam?
Yeah, I think this was a very unique election, and there's a lot that can be learned from it. I think there were assumptions made going into it, as you and I discussed, that were incorrect. And I would caution people making assumptions coming out of it in being equally as incorrect. And there were 2 pretty unpopular candidates from both major parties. And you know, that obviously had huge ramifications with respect to the outcome. I mean, both parties turned out their bases for sure. there were late news events for both parties that kind of confirmed what people believed about the other. And the independents played an outsized role in the outcome, particularly when one looks at that blue firewall, where Barack Obama performed so well, and where Hillary Clinton faltered, which was ultimately, obviously, the determining factor in the outcome. So I think it is a unique election. I think as people who study this and who work in this field, we need to be thoughtful and cautious kind of about kind of the assumptions that we make, but we should certainly learn from it as much as we can.
Howard, do you agree with that?
Well, I'm not known for being thoughtfully cautious, so I'm not.
Of course you are.
I agree with a little bit. I think what's going on is a much bigger mega change. And I think it has to do with, one, Washington being even more out of touch than usual because people in Washington really don't understand the culture in the rest of the country. I like to say that Washington is like middle school on steroids. They have their own little culture and who's doing what to who and all this stuff. And what they get fuss about is how many times they've been on television and who's interviewed them. And honestly, most Americans don't care, and it doesn't matter to most Americans. So that's part of the problem, is they're more out of touch than usual, although they've been out of touch on and off for a variety of reasons, and because they don't know anything about the internet. The other problem is that our children don't believe in institutions. And I think that's actually the biggest problem with parties. People are always going to be, if you only have two choices, there's always going to be a significant number of people who are unhappy. In Europe, there's still a ton of people who don't vote because they have 5 choices and they don't like any of them. So this is not going to fix the problem. But I think the real problem is our kids, unlike us who marched around for 7 years trying to get the Vietnam War done and still haven't finished civil rights, they go online, get 500,000 people to say they're going to take their money out of Bank of America and put it someplace else. So Bank of America is forced to change for example, their proposed debit card fee. Or the telephone company, they made Verizon, after 3 days, rescind a policy to charge $2 for paying your bill online, because they said they'd take the money and buy AT&T phones instead. So these kids have an enormous power, and doesn't extend to, look at the airport policies, the Women's March, which out-trumped Trump by about a figure of 500%. I mean, this is incredible, but they're great at mobilizing. They're not great at organizing because it's all ad hoc. They have so much power, they can go and do this, and then when something else comes along, they're very entrepreneurial, and they move on to the next thing. So I think Danny is right. People are always kind of tired of politics, and this was a unique election that they're very tired of politics, partly because of the nature of the candidates and so forth and so on. I think largely because where we are, we're in a very peculiar place historically, which I think we'll talk about later. But I think a tremendous amount of this has to do with the fact that a whole generation of Americans has grown up to think they don't need institutions, and now they've discovered they do. And the idea that we're going to teach them how to use our institutions is ludicrous. We're not. They're going to have to figure it out for themselves. We can help, but we can't tell them how to structure their institutions. They're not going to listen to us.
Okay, so Beth, this is what you do for a living. You study this stuff. You look at it historically. You try to sort of explain it. You've heard different sort of takes on where we are today. What's your take on it?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity for unconventional candidates. I wouldn't necessarily say there's huge opportunity for independent or third-party candidates just because of the structure of our political system, and especially at the state level. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for unconventional candidates who go against the typical party line but run within the party. So a Bernie Sanders, a Donald Trump. So I do think it was a unique election in American politics, but it's not unique in terms of global electoral politics. I mean, we have Brexit, we have the French election, so I think, and most recently the German elections. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for unconventional candidates, but it's probably within the parties as opposed to outside.
Okay, so Jackie, so the question in terms of the rising independence, if you will, first of all, is the system so rigged by the two parties that it's almost impossible to sort of move past it? And is this something that can happen at a local level, or does it have to happen only at the presidential level?
I think the system is very substantially rigged. against independent candidates, as you were referencing.
Why don't you give a couple examples of what you mean by that?
Oh, everything from the inequities in what it takes to access the ballot. If you're an independent presidential candidate, for example, you need over 1 million signatures to get on the ballot. A Democrat or Republican need about 50,000 signatures in order to qualify through their primary process and so forth. Independent voters are locked out of primary voting in many states. And independents are kept out of debates where voters are making their decisions, hopefully their informed decisions about who they want to vote for. But I think that, if you will, perhaps an important point to make about that is that these barriers have existed for a very, very long time. And they're very much sort of the standard operating procedure of how politics is done. Greg knows that from his experience in running for office, and you know, I've seen this in many, many different situations. I think what's new is that there is an emergent clash, if you will, between that kind of institutionalized authoritarianism exercised by the parties, because after all, it's the parties who make those laws. So they actually referee the game that they're competing in, which is not a healthy situation. But you have that level of authoritarian control where the parties are more and more dedicated to wanting to maintain control over their voters and the machinery of government that they control, on the one hand, while you have the size of the independent voter bloc growing now to 44, 45% of the country. And the pressure, I think, that's being created by those who want to stand outside of the party system and the control that the party system exerts, that pressure, I think, is what's accounting for a lot of the dynamics that got played out in this last election and will in the future.
Okay, well, Danny, is that a fair critique? Does the system kind of, basically the Dems and the Republicans figure we're kind of in charge and we don't want to let go of anything?
It's our system. We can change it.
I understand that.
I think sometimes
Good.
I think sometimes when we look at where we are, and we don't look at like things in full context from a historical standpoint, if you will. The two-party system, certainly for the last 50 years, has been dominant. But it hasn't been a constant in American history, not by any stretch of the imagination. There was a guy who 60% of Americans voted against in 1860 and became, I think R&D can agree, America's most successful president. And so there's a guy, I think, who was president and wanted to become president again and ran on a third-party ticket and got, 27, 28% of the vote. So our history shows that there's always been competition with respect to the parties and outside candidates and whatnot. We are where we are today, but there's always been room for somebody outside of kind of the structured party system, and there's going to be room going forward.
Howard?
I actually don't agree with that. I think what the role of third parties often is to create space for new ideas that neither of the conventional parties will touch. Bernie's a perfect example of this. When Bernie just submitted his single-payer bill, which he does every Congress, he had 15 Democrats sign on. Previous to that, none signed on. So by him going out there, now he was in a party theoretically, but it was pretty clear that he was pretty blunt about saying he wasn't, even though he was running in the Democratic primary. But he really acted like a third-party candidate in the sense that he had some issues, he laid them out there. All of a sudden, you find out that 60% of the American people think Medicare for all is a great idea, and now the third party has created what the value of third parties has been in American democracy, which is not so much that they get elected, although Abraham Lincoln was obviously the exception to that, the only third-party candidate we ever had that got elected at a most peculiar time in our history. But that third-party person brings ideas that are then adopted by the major parties. It's cumbersome. I'm not sure we might not be better off with more parties. I'm kind of sympathetic with that, which is an unusual position for the former chair of the DNC. But I think democracy is in trouble, and I think giving people more choices. I'm also very much in favor of instant runoff voting. I think it's a terrible mistake not to have that if you have multiple candidates. But I do think third-party candidates, the game is rigged against third-party candidates. But it's rigged in such a way that third-party candidates often don't, while not getting elected, do have a great deal to contribute and have moved the dialogue dramatically in our system over the history of the two-party system.
Can I just say something about that? I think that's such an important historical point you're making about the role that third parties have played, raising issues, whether it's women's suffrage or labor organizing or what you just described with the dynamic with Bernie. However, something that I think is so fascinating and complicated today is that such a big part of public anger and dissatisfaction with the political system is over the issue of partisanship. That's the issue that is driving so much of what's happening in the country today. So in a sense, you have a situation where the American people are saying, we want to deal with the problem of partisanship, but to have to turn to the parties to be able to do that is really a conundrum. And whereas parties in the past have been able to absorb social movement issues that have come from different quarters, this is a very different situation because the parties are the problem. So how do the parties take up that banner and address that in a way that satisfies how the American public feels about the political system?
And you've given me the setup for my next question to Greg Orman, which is that so how does an independent looking at this dissatisfaction, the partisanship, the leaner numbers, all the things we've talked about so far tonight, someone looking to run as an independent, what is the calculus that you do, and what is the appeal that one might have to get past the institutional barriers of being an independent?
Well, I think any candidate that runs for office on the basis of calculus is a bad candidate. Okay, at the end of the day, this is about improving people's lives. And so if you don't have a point of view and a frame of reference for how you can do that and why you want to do that, I think that's an issue. I think the basic question you ask is, as you evaluate a race, why would you run as an independent? And frankly, it would be easier to run as a Democrat or a Republican. In fact, after our race in 2014, I met with Bob Dole, and Bob Dole said to me, you know, if you'd have just said you were going to be a Republican, you'd be in the Senate right now. And I said, you know what, I understand that, I know that's right, but would I be getting anything done? And he thought about it for a minute, and he looked at me, and with sadness sort of came over him, and he said, no, you wouldn't. And he said, and I don't understand that. So for me, I've gotten to the point where I'm no longer invested in the argument of who's worse, the Democrats or the Republicans, because that's really the decision voters are making today. It's negative partisanship. We don't particularly like our own party, but we sure hate the other party. And so I'm not invested in that anymore. I'm not invested in that debate because I think it's the wrong question. I think the question we have to ask about the two-party system is it set up in a way that allows it to solve problems for the American people? And I think that's what's driving the dissatisfaction. And my concern is, with all this negative partisanship, it reminds me of a married couple going through a bitter divorce. You know, they don't talk to each other anymore. When they do, they mistrust each other's intentions. They don't share the same goals. And getting Republicans and Democrats to go to Washington, D.C. and solve our country's problems is a little bit like putting that married couple in a room and saying, figure it out. And I don't believe it's going to happen without the intervention of a third force, and I think we've got lots of historical anecdotes for that. You look at the peace process in Northern Ireland. I don't think without the intervention of the United States, the Catholics and the Protestants put down their swords. I think the same thing is true of Israel and Palestine. I don't think we would find ourselves saying, well, they're going to figure it out on their own. You know, every president in my lifetime has been engaged in that issue. And so I think we've gotten to the point, 58% of Republicans now view Democrats very unfavorably. 55% of Republicans view Democrats or 55% of Democrats view Republicans very unfavorably. And by the way, I don't know if you've looked at these surveys, there is no worse category. It's not like they say, you know, hate them as much as I hate fried liver. There is no worse category than very unfavorably. And in that sort of context, compromise is almost impossible. And we have a system of government that only works if we have compromise. And so I'm not invested in that question of who's worse anymore. I'm saying, what do we need to do to solve problems for the American people?
Okay, Howard, you want to jump in?
I just want to say a couple of things in defense of parties, not that they're in great shape right now. First of all, parties are a structure where you can get compromise inside the party. You have people all over the place inside the Democratic Party, and in the Republican Party, it's quite obvious. And parties give a structure, even though some of it's very cumbersome and platforms and so forth. But even inside the House, if whichever is the control, this is one of the reasons I think Paul Ryan struggles as a speaker, because he can't bring his party together, because he's got the 30 or 40 Tea Party people or whatever, the Freedom Coalition that won't vote for anything unless they all approve it. But this is one thing that Pelosi could do and did do very well. She got a whole lot of people who were far to the left and Democrats who were on the rightish center to all vote for the Affordable Care Act. Now, you may or may not like the Affordable Care Act, but in fact, it was a major achievement by President Obama. So the parties can do that. The other thing that's interesting about parties, I do a tremendous amount of traveling, and a lot of places I go have parliamentary democracies. The difference between our democracy and a parliamentary democracy, there are a number of them, but one of the biggest ones that people don't think about is we make our coalitions before the election. We put our platform together and our messages together to appeal to a certain number of people, which we hope is going to get us to 50% plus one. A multi-party system doesn't have to do that. They make their coalitions after the election, so the election really doesn't end things. Germany, I think, probably is going to get a government together, but if they didn't, they'd have to have a new election, and that's not uncommon at all. So there are some things to be said for the two-party system. I agree right now, all the things that folks have said here are true. It's a low point, but I think that's because politics and the Western democracies are in trouble for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with the politics, and that has to do with the pace of globalization and who got left behind by globalization, which is why I argue the Brexit voters and the Trump voters and the AfD voters in Germany were all the same.
Beth, what do you think in terms of what you've been hearing from a historic perspective? Is this just a little bump in the road, or are things really going to be different from this point forward, do you think?
I mean, the difficulty is that we are structured as a two-party system. The electoral system we have sets it up so that we end up with two parties. You don't get any prizes for second place. And that makes it really difficult for third parties or independent candidates to succeed. But there's more than that. I think what, this discussion of negative partisanship ignores that there is a large percentage of people who are positive partisans. Survey data bears that out, that there are people who do like the Republicans, and there are people who, I know it sounds strange, but there are people who like the Republicans and like the Democrats. And so lumping everyone who dislikes them into this category and calling them independents and saying, well, that's the group I'm going to go after, I think is a mistake for independent candidates, because there are very different types of people being lumped together.
I want to go a little back into the first point that you made. In my lifetime, there were two presidential campaigns that got a significant portion of the vote, that is double digits, and in one case electoral votes. Of course, that was George Wallace in 1968 and Ross Perot in 1992. George Wallace created what was called the American Independent Party, and it was on the ballots in 50 states. The Reform Party was created by Ross Perot in all 50 states. With different leadership and different focus, could those two parties have succeeded? Could they have remained beyond the personality of the individual that created them?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you.
No, I don't think so. I mean, so the Ross Perot case is difficult because he ran originally as the independent and does reasonably well, and then he forms the Reform Party, and then it's co-opted by Buchanan, and it becomes something very different than he intended. But even at his height, when most people would argue he had a lot of dissatisfaction with the Republican and Democratic candidates, he still only got 20% of the vote nationwide and no electoral college votes. So I don't think the Electoral College is structured for an independent to succeed.
Yeah, I would actually say we've got to remember Ross Perot's first race in the context of what happened. You know, in June, he's leading in the polls. Then he drops out of the race because Republican dirty tricksters were going to disrupt his daughter's wedding. And then he re-entered the race in September. So I think that might have been a very different outcome had he not taken the summer off. The other thing I would say is there's been a lot of discussion of leaners, and this is something that we hear a lot about independent voters. It's sort of an attempt to sort of diminish their independence by saying they really lean to the left or they really lean to the right. And you know, Charlie Whelan, who started an organization called the Centrist Project, had a great explanation for this. He said, you know, most Americans claim they like lobsters, but when they go to the buffet line at the wedding, they pick only the chicken or the beef. Therefore, they must really not like lobster. He said the problem is there's no lobster in the buffet line. And that's part of the problem that we have with independent candidates, is that while people, 40% of America today, by Gallup's estimate, 45% of America 2 months ago, it's been trending in the 40s for the last 2 years, say that they are independent, we only still give them two choices, Democrats or Republicans. So of course they naturally lean. For me, being politically independent is not about ideology. Being politically independent is about putting your country and your state before a political party. It's about thinking for yourself and using facts and common sense to solve problems, not clinging to rigid ideological solutions even when they're failing. And it's about not being obligated to the party bosses and the special interests that control both parties. It's not ideological. In my world, there's room in the independent movement for principled conservatives, principled liberals, as long as you take that approach to politics.
So let me ask this question. Do we solve a lot of these problems if we go to sort of a uniform jungle primary approach, which basically means that you run and the people who get the two most votes then are elected, are on the ballot in November? It could be two Democrats, two Republicans, or an independent. It doesn't really matter. Does that sort of get away from some of the problems we've got?
I think it does, and I'll explain. So I'm not going to use California as the example because we're straddling two states that have voted Republican for the last couple of times. So let's use Kansas as the example, and why, as a Democrat, I think it would be a great idea to have a so-called jungle primary. A jungle primary is everybody runs in a single primary on primary day. Let's just suppose it's in September. And the top two vote getters, regardless of party, are in the general election. Now, you would ask why I, as a Democrat, would possibly want that in Kansas, since the top two vote getters are likely to be Republican. It's because it brings the middle-of-the-road voter back into the picture. What happens today in Kansas is that if you are seen talking to a Democrat in Washington, or you anger Steve Bannon, you get a challenger from the right. And so the Democrats in California, Dianne Feinstein, now has a challenger from the left. What? So the whole system as we have it today moves us further and further to the extremes, and therefore further and further apart. It compromises people in the middle who might like to consider being an independent. If you have a jungle primary, I have more of a role as a Democrat in Kansas than I would otherwise, because what happens today is the Democrat wins the nomination, and they get 35% of the vote, and I dutifully go out and vote for them, knowing my candidate's not going to win. If you had two Republicans on top of the ballot, not something I hope happens. I mean, I'd love to see Kansas have two Democrats on top of the ballot, but if you have two Republicans, I get to go out and vote for the most moderate Republican. And all of a sudden, instead of this race to the right in the Republican Party, or the race to the left in the Democratic Party in a place like California, now the average voter is driving the voters back to, the candidates back to where they are, which statistically is in the center. So I think a jungle primary works. I was somewhat horrified as the former chairman of a party when I first came out, but I really truly believe that it actually has an ameliorating effect. The other thing you've got to do, and you could get conservative and liberal Americans to vote for this if you'd put it on the ballots, and that is to take the power of gerrymandering away from the state legislators. They should not be able to write their own job descriptions and give it to independent commissions. It works in Iowa. Iowa is a swing state. They've had 2 and 2 or 3 and 2 back and forth for years and years and years. Their delegation truly reflects Iowa most of the time. And we really do need those two reforms, regardless of whether you have independents in the race or not, because our system now is broken because it simply pulls people apart instead of driving people together.
So Danny, I'll get to you in just a second, Jerry. So what's your take on the jungle primary from a Republican perspective? Good, bad, or indifferent?
My experience with it is in California, and it's not great. 2 Democrats running in the general election, right? Look, I think somebody mentioned France earlier.
I'm sorry?
Somebody mentioned France
Right.
earlier, and I want to say that it was the first time in French history where neither major party was participated in the second runoff. And there's something happening that's bigger than just the US, right? Look at Mexico, PRI and PAN, which have been institutions in that country, are now both parties are kind of wobbly. I think, you know, there's something that's bigger that's happening, and if we need a third party, I think the third party should earn it. I think they should get on every ballot. I think they should appeal to voters. I think they should try and win, as opposed to us contorting our political system to a third party. I mean, Greg made a very salient point. Ross Perot was doing really, really well, call it in the beginning of summer. And he got out of the race, and he came in pretty late, call it September and October, and his support had cut in half. Would the Reform Party have lasted? Maybe, if you want, right? I think you have to go out and you have to win. I think you have to go out and you have to organize. And I think that is the responsibility if you want the most potent office on the planet. And I think if you have a candidate with enough appeal, and message is always king, with a message that resonates, it's achievable. But I don't know that we need to kind of contort our system to accommodate that versus that. Make winning and seizing, and then having a mandate to make possible changes.
Jackie, does the jungle primary solve a lot of the problems that you've identified?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. And I'm really glad to hear that you support it. And I want you to go home to the DNC, and I want you to tell them we must do this for the 2020 presidential. Look, the important thing about the nonpartisan top 2 primary or the jungle primary is not the outcome that it produces in the short term. I don't think that's a good argument to make, frankly. The importance of the top 2 jungle primary is that it sets the stage for new kinds of coalitions and new things to happen that have never happened before. In California, for example, where the top 2 system is in place, yes, 2 Democrats have made it to the final round in many races, including in the US Senate race. By the way, an interesting feature in California was that 3 million voters voted for Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, and then for either Kamala Harris or Loretta Sanchez in the US Senate race, which seemed to be completely contradictory, and yet, under that system, voters were suddenly free to put some things together that they'd never been in a position to put together before. The nonpartisan system also makes elected officials more accountable to the total electorate that they're supposed to represent, rather than to the party from which they were elected. And the University of Southern California, the Schwarzenegger Institute, has done some wonderful studies on this very issue and shown that in an open primary state, elected officials respond to the whole electorate, and in a closed primary state, they respond to the segment of the electorate that's in their party, their so-called prime voters.
Okay, but and Beth, this is to you. Taking that, I know the argument about an open primary system. The counter argument is we're Republicans or we're Democrats, and we're the ones who get to choose who our candidates ought to be on the November ballot. What do you think about that? What makes the most sense? Does it undermine the 2-party system by having open primaries?
I think it depends on what you think the primary's purpose is. If the primary's purpose is to select nominees to represent a party, then it makes total sense for those primaries to be closed. If the goal of a primary is to determine who the two candidates are that are facing off in a general election, which is what they've become, then it makes a lot of sense to have jungle primaries. But I think the goal has to be clear to determine which is more effective. But I would add, though, that there are positive advantages to a jungle primary. We saw in California, certainly, and certainly the Democrats saw the advantages to a jungle primary. But there are also some negatives that I think you can't ignore. When you change systems and processes, those negative consequences come along. Louisiana is probably the classic example where you do have not a jungle primary of sorts, but a nonpartisan primary, and there are sometimes negative consequences. You have extreme candidates that sometimes make it to the, and France is another example, that make it to the second round or make it to the general election that then nobody wants to vote for. And so you do have to weigh the good and the bad with these kinds of changes.
Greg?
You know, a couple of thoughts. Number one, I think in our system today we get extreme candidates. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily a reason not to engage in electoral reform. You know, as it relates to ranked choice voting, which Governor Dean mentioned, and the jungle primary, you know, I think both are great innovations. I think both make a lot of sense, but we also have to recognize that there are only something like 21 or 22 states that have citizen-driven initiatives. So in many states, these reforms require the consent of the victims. It requires the people who are going to get hurt by losing their political power and control to give that up. And so it's hard to do. But you know, the California example I think is real interesting on top two primaries, in part because the first year they did that, I believe it was 2014, it might have been 2012, I believe they had 6 contested congressional races where Democrat ran against a Democrat or a Republican ran against a Republican. In 5 out of those 6 races, the moderate won. So to Governor Dean's point about it expanding and bringing people back to the middle, it definitely did that. At the legislative level, the California Chamber of Commerce identified 40 bills that they thought would be job-killing bills out of the 600 or so that were introduced in the Assembly and the Senate. The Assembly and the Senate were both dominated by Democrats. They had a Democratic governor. 38 out of those 40 bills didn't pass. The Assembly, by every measure, became much more moderate with a top two primary. And so I think there are lots of natural advantages to these reforms, but we have to recognize how difficult they are to get done because they do require the consent of the victims.
No, and I would ask one final question before we're going to start getting some questions from our audience here. This goes to you, Danny, because the Republican Party is in control of the White House and the House and the Senate. There is, and the two questions that really sort of all boiled into one is, and I know you have a very good grasp of political history, can you recall a time when there was as much back and forth in a negative way between members of the same party, President, House, and Senate, and taking that to the next step is, what role is what Bannon's doing? How do you think it's going to change the Republican Party, or is it not going to change it at all?
Yeah, look, I think there's always friction within parties to varying degrees. And I think a lot of it is predicated on the significance of the issues that you're trying to surmount. I mean, I worked on President George W. Bush's reelect, and I remember very vividly working on Social Security reform and immigration reform. And Social Security reform had more Republican support than immigration reform. And on that issue, he, in some ways, took on his own party, right? And I'll note, and in some cases without the support of Democrats, on an important issue, right? I think they agreed more than they disagreed. And so I think there's always friction within these parties. And a lot of it has to do with timing, political capital, standing, dynamics, some things kind of outside of your control. You know, was it Lyndon Johnson, when he passed the Civil Rights Bill, what did he say? We gave up the South, right? I mean, so there are moments of great consequence, and certainly those two very different presidents, two very different times, where people take on big issues, and there are consequences for endeavoring and maybe failing, or even succeeding in Johnson's case. And so I just think we need to understand that. We need to be real about it, and this might be correct or incorrect.
Do you think the nature of the Republican candidates for the Senate will be different because you think Bannon will be, or Bannon, or that wing of the party will be
Right.
successful and challenging the
Well,
incumbents?
I think we saw some of this in 2010. I think the governor will remember. There were some contested primaries on the Republican side, and some members lost. I mean, Lugar lost in Indiana.
I remember.
Castle lost in Delaware, right? And there are others. These campaigns matter. The operation that you field matters, and it's conceivable that some will. Now, the map isn't tilted in such a way with Republican U.S. Senate seats that are in play this cycle. There are less. Looking at maybe a 20, right? A 22, a 24, the map changes dramatically. Everybody, you mentioned Arizona, everybody's aware of Flake. Nevada, everyone's aware of Heller.
Right.
There are less seats that allow for that kind of movement this cycle than there will be in future cycles. So I think we've dealt with it in the past, in 2010, 2012. I think we'll deal with it again. I think it's really hard to unseat a Republican or Democratic incumbent, and that's been proven.
Okay, so my final question here for anyone on the panel who wants to take it, then we are going to go to the questions from the audience, is if we take the argument that because the primaries, whether in the Democratic Party to the left or the Republican Party to the right in terms of the challenges, does that mean that basically an independent who does not have a primary is more likely to not feel as sort of pulled or pushed or as uncomfortable doing things that sometimes are difficult to do because he has the whole much larger constituency to play to? Anybody want to jump on that?
I think the core problems for independents are one of the election laws in almost every state. I mean, New York is the most difficult possible to run as an independent because I had to actually give 3 electors because I had a full slate in New York to John Kerry, who was the nominee and didn't have a full slate. That's how awful it is to try to get on the New York City ballot, or New York State ballot. So you've got the election laws. The other problem is you've got the apparatus. I mean, I don't think that a billionaire like Ross Perot or Bloomberg could ever win the presidency because there's troops that are willing to work for Democrats or troops that are willing to work for Republicans that they have to build from nothing. And that is just an incredibly difficult task. That's what infrastructure is for. I mean, the parties provide infrastructure, and we can all complain about, all the things that go wrong, but infrastructure matters enormously. Barack Obama has had the largest margin of anybody for a while. If he hadn't run as a Democrat and he'd run as an independent, he would have made a great showing and lost. Because the party infrastructure, and the Republican infrastructure is even better than ours these days. They're incredibly well organized, they're disciplined, and they're a team. Look, one of the things I teach students is about politics. The first thing I teach them is you have to understand that politics is a substitute for war. Politics is asset allocation and succession. That's what war is about, asset allocation and succession. This is really serious business. And campaigns, I mean, that's a war term, right? That's what this is about. We don't kill each other anymore. We just had the French Revolution in this country. Nobody went to the guillotine. That was an improvement over 1789. So don't underestimate, even at their worst, and I would say the parties are not, especially the Democratic Party is not strong because we're going through a huge generational transition such as we have never seen before. But at our worst, we're stronger than trying to build something from nothing. Even if you have $1 gazillion to go out and hire people, it is not the same thing. And even Bernie, who ran an incredible campaign, it's not entirely clear to me that without the apparatus, which is why I think he chose to run as a Democrat, without the apparatus as the Democratic Party, which was going to come to him automatically if he won the nomination, I don't think he could have won as an independent.
Okay, before we go to the questions, our fact checkers, have we had anything there that you think we need to be corrected that you've heard today so far? The answer is no? That's good,
Look at
okay.
that.
Secondly, I failed to mention that we have civility bells. Anyone have a civility bell they can ring? Anybody? Come on, somebody, I know we have some out there. Okay. These bells are rung in case anybody gets a little over their skis. And so far that hasn't happened, and so we're happy. We'll let you know there are people out there watching. Okay, Nick Haynes, give us a question.
It hasn't happened yet, Alan, but that could happen. By the way, not only is this the largest American Public Square event, we also have an overflow room watching this. That overflow room, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is called Sprint Center. They're there, okay? We have so many people. 73 questions here about what jungle gyms have to do with independent candidates. I think they missed the point. Mike wants to know, though, with Donald Trump becoming increasingly isolated, this is the questioner's question, what are the chances of him running in the next presidential election as a candidate of a new party, like the Trump Party, which of course gives him the opportunity to put his name on something else?
Anybody want to take that?
You know, I think it's a very, very low probability, and in large part for many of the reasons that Governor Dean mentioned, which is if he runs as a Republican, he obviously gets the benefit of the Republican Party apparatus. It's something that he used to help him raise almost $500 million for his last campaign. And so I think it would be highly unlikely that he would do anything other than run for re-election as a Republican.
Danny, as our registered Republican, you got a thought on that?
I completely concur. And, you know, when you look at the president's numbers with Republican primary voters, he is scoring in the mid to high 80s in a lot of states. So there's, from his perspective, from a party perspective, there'd be no need to deviate, at least at this moment, from kind of the structure as has been set. And I think his campaign has been very clear, was very clear about the role that the national party infrastructure, the Republican National Committee, its data operation, its field operation had in the outcome of the race. So I think the chances are near zero, to be candid.
Okay.
I'd just like to make one observation about this, and Danny can correct me if he thinks I'm mistaken, but I think because of the nature and the temperament of the two parties, of who ends up in the Democratic Party and who ends up in the Republican Party, I think I can't remember the last time there was an insurgent candidate that won the nomination. That happens all the time in our party. So I think the Republicans are more top-down organized. And I think in our party it is possible to, to come in and run as an independent like Bernie did in our party, or challenge the front runner and win, as Barack Obama did in 2008. We're a little more fluid, but Trump has terrific control of the apparatus of his party, because you can do that in the Republican Party if you're the president. Control that Democrats generally do not have as much of, unless they're incredibly skillful. Clinton did it, but Barack Obama did not.
Well, 76, it was a guy that almost took the reins at the Republican convention against an incumbent president. Right?
That's true. That's true, but he was an unelected incumbent president.
Okay, Nick, what's next?
Along with questions from the audience, Kansas City Star readers are live streaming this, watching this from a live streaming from the kansascity.com website, from the Facebook page of the Kansas City Star. Colleen Nelson, the head of the editorial board, is the back, curating all of those questions. What question have you got for us, Colleen?
Well, Robert's watching on Facebook Live, and he asked, do any of the panelists see the possibility of a Republican and a Democrat joining one ticket in 2020? Obviously, we had the idea floated with Governors Kasich and Hickenlooper, but could that actually happen in 2020?
Okay.
When John McCain was considering Joe Lieberman for a running mate, I think one had to look at what the rules were in each one of these states to qualify. And each state, as you know, has its own election laws. And I don't know, and I don't believe that under the current structure that would even be permissible, in that you need to be a Republican in some of these states for a certain amount of time to qualify to be the Republican Party's presidential or vice presidential nominee. So we were talking about the nature of these campaigns and how you get on the ballot and all of this. It is a real difficult thing, and you need to understand the process. I don't know. I'm not exact on it, but I'm pretty confident. I don't know that our process would allow for that, to be honest with you.
Jackie, go ahead.
An interesting question about creating such a ticket is what's the process, as you're saying, by which a ticket of that kind would be created. Now, something that's being talked about now in a lot of different quarters is the question of, could we create what I'm going to call here an all-independents primary for the 2020 presidential election? We experimented with this, by the way, in the Reform Party, and the Reform Party was talked about a little bit earlier. I was one of the founders. There were many of the Reform Party. The Reform Party was really an experiment in trying to create a non-ideological left-right coalition that brought political and fiscal reform to the forefront, and it was largely destroyed by interventions by the major parties. But we did, in that brief time, try to create a new process in which independent voters could come together across the spectrum and choose a presidential ticket. I think for 2020, if you were able to construct something like that, which after all would have to live outside of the party-governed nominating process,
Correct.
but you could nonetheless create something like that, and then Americans of all walks of life could come together and through a process of elimination choose a ticket that might end up being a Democrat and Republican fusion ticket.
But isn't that really sort of presuming this is all going to happen in a vacuum? In other words, that there are all kinds of other cross currents that are going to be going on as this process goes forward, and it's not in the interest, well, maybe in the interest of one party, but not the other, for this to be more or less successful.
There was an effort like this, I think it was in 2008, although it died long before we got too close to 2008, where a couple of very wealthy hedge fund guys or something like that hired a group to work in Washington who were both Republican and Democratic operatives to come up with exactly this. And they wanted somebody to run for president and then have somebody from the opposite party. They couldn't get headliners to do it. They were talking about third-party people and people maybe
Wasn't
nobody
this an
ever...
online deal that they set up?
No, well, some of it was on, yeah, there was going to be an online primary. And the problem is nobody would do it.
But part of the reason that nobody would do it is that, among other things, they couldn't guarantee that the nominee of that process would be admitted to the televised presidential debates. And consequently, without being able to assure that there was a pathway for an independent candidate to those debates, the headliners, so-called, didn't want to take that risk. That's one of the reasons that you really have to get in and excavate a lot of these barriers if you want to be able to open a pathway for independent competition.
I'm actually going to disagree with you because I was one of the people who were interviewed as a prospective candidate. And the reason I didn't have any interest is I knew what they were really doing was going to hurt the Democratic Party, and I would just split the Democratic vote, and then the Republican would have an easier chance to get in. So it had nothing to do with, at least in my case, with considerations about whether I could get on the debate stage or not. It had to do with what the ultimate goal was, which I thought was to destroy the Democratic nominee, not to actually have a great independent possibility.
Greg, you want to jump in?
That's
here?
actually an interesting comment because it's something we saw when we ran in 2014. When I told people I was an independent, if you were a Democrat, you heard Republican. If you were a Republican, you heard Democrat. And so having some firsthand knowledge of what was called at the time Unity 08 and then in 2012 called Americans Elect,
That's what
it was.
Yeah,
that's what I was thinking.
they were genuinely trying to create a bipartisan ticket. Now, there's some question as to whether or not if you nominated a bipartisan ticket and there was a Democrat at the top of the ticket and a Republican at the bottom of the ticket, that might have pulled more votes from Democrats than if you had a Republican at the top of the ticket. But I can tell you from firsthand knowledge, their intentions were really genuine. They wanted to give voters another choice. They wanted a choice that would possibly bring the country together, and based on the belief that more competition would lead to more electoral accountability and hopefully better results for the American people. But nonetheless, it did fail, and as Jackie points out, one of the reasons they heard from a number of their candidates was that they couldn't get into the presidential debate, but they heard many other reasons. A lot of people just said, hey, look, I'm a lifetime Republican or a lifetime Democrat, and you know, the idea of doing something outside of my party, you know, is just not appealing to me. Others had different reasons. Were concerned about getting the institutional support and the money, and so there were all sorts of reasons why that wasn't successful in 2012.
Nick, what do we got
Yes,
next?
more questions from the Facebook Live of the Kansas City Star in just a moment, but back to our questions from our auditorium. Phil, by the way, is still caught up in the conversation that Greg mentioned at the beginning with Bob Dole, where he says if he had gone to the Senate and he was a Republican, he wouldn't be able to enact the changes that he wanted to see. But what would you have actually been able to do as an independent? What is the real value of independents if they still have to caucus?
Well, and that's a great question, and you know, frankly, I'll answer that in a couple of ways. You know, there was a discussion around that time, and there was a possibility that if I got elected as an independent, the Senate wouldn't have a clear majority, that I might have been the swing vote. And my intention, if that were the case, would be to go to both parties and say, look, I'm willing to support in the vote to organize the Senate one of these parties as long as you engage in a pro-problem solving agenda, as long as you stop playing games, etc. And by the way, if after a period of 6 months you fundamentally were still playing the same old partisan games, I wouldn't hesitate to switch my allegiance and vote for someone else. And I think we saw this when Eric Cantor lost his primary. He was the majority leader in the House. He said he was going to stay until November, I believe, initially, so that his successor in Virginia would have seniority in the House, technically. And then after they had a new majority leader election and showed Eric Cantor what his new office would look like, he quit the next day. And so I think the ability to hold the majority accountable outside of the context of an election would have been something that we haven't tried before. But the other thing, I just take it back and say, and you know, I got asked this question by Chuck Todd on one of the shows. He said, but if you did that or if you chose not to caucus, you wouldn't be on any committees. And my comment to him was, what's the value of being on a committee that gets nothing done? And you know, we're sitting here in Missouri. The Truman Library Foundation is a part of this event. In 1948, Harry Truman ran for re-election as president. He ran against Congress, the 80th Congress. He called it the Do-Nothing Congress. Well, the 80th Congress, Harry Truman's Do-Nothing Congress, passed twice as much legislation as the 113th and 114th Congress combined. So decision-making has ground to a halt right now, and my belief is we are at a time, a recent Republican Senator, Olympia Snowe, said this in her farewell address to the Senate. She said, we've lost the art of legislating at a time when our country faces monumental consequences. You know, Governor Dean, Danny Diaz have pointed out the great transformations that technology, that outsourcing, that automation have had on the American people. The fact of the matter is that's only going to accelerate with artificial intelligence. And if we don't get Washington back into the business of solving problems, our standard of living, our status in the world, and the very existence of the middle class in America is at risk. And that's why I wanted to try something that I thought might jumpstart problem solving in Washington, because I think it is so consequential, and what we are doing is clearly not working.
Okay, we're watching this at the World War I Museum. Many more people are watching in their homes, in their cars, hopefully not driving while they're on their iPhones and tablets. Thanks to the Kansas City Star and their Facebook Live page. Colleen, you're curating those questions. What other questions have you got?
We're getting a lot of questions about independence tonight, and Audrey has a question for the independents on the panel. She asks, independent means different things to different people. Do independents see themselves as progressives? If not, what viewpoint or ideology do they represent?
Well, I can speak to that, yeah. A great question. Independence, in my experience, and I've been organizing in the independent movement for 30 years in a variety of different vehicles and contexts, independents span the spectrum from left to right on the ideological questions or the social issue questions. The issues, though, that tie independents together, to build on some of what you were just saying, Greg, are the issues of the political process itself. You poll the question of the nonpartisan top 2 primary, for example, among independents. 97% of independents support that structural change. You ask independents, should there be an opening to include an independent presidential candidate in the Commission on Presidential Debates sponsored debates? 96%. Got to do that. The American people need to hear more voices, more ideas. The other thing about independents is that while they have differences on social and economic policy issues, they believe that the culture of American politics needs to be one of unity, not of division. And one of the things that we have found in research that's being done now out of Arizona State University is that independents, as Americans, have friends who are Democrats, Republicans, and independents, liberals, moderates, and conservatives. And consequently, unlike the silo-based social networks that so many people that are partisans have, independents are actually playing a role of breaking down some of these partisan divisions in daily life. So I think the question of who is the independent voter is a movement in the making that has the capacity to transform the culture of the way we do politics. And for me, that's really the most fundamentally important reason why I think we need to find ways to bring those voters into full equity and full parity in the political process.
Okay, so I want to talk to Danny and to Howard for just a second here. According to the Pew study in July of this year, among Democrats, there are only, among Democrats, 65% have either just a few or no Republican friends. Okay? None.
Right, yeah.
Among Republicans, 55% have few or no Republican friends. We're not talking here about who you're going to vote. We're talking about friends, okay?
Yeah.
So now, assuming that both parties, which I assume, want to solve problems, want to figure out a way to sort of work their way through all these problems that everyone acknowledges are out there, what is the Democratic and the Republican approach? We just heard sort of the independent approach, if you will, of how this is going to supposedly help us. What can the Democrats do? What can the Republicans do to deal with this?
Historically, it's come down to personal relationships. And that's how you solve your differences with people. You get to know them as a human being first, and then you can have a discussion about how to deal with it.
That's why we exist. So we agree with you completely on that.
No, I mean, but I mean that's what has to happen, and for a variety of reasons that's disappeared in the Congress and in many political areas. In state legislatures, it's not quite as bad, although mine is an exception, maybe. I mean, I get along very well with both Republicans and Democrats. The best years I had as governor was when one chamber was controlled by one party and the other was controlled by the opposite party, because I could use my alliances with the Republicans to rein in Democratic spending and use my alliances with the Democrats to make sure no horrible social legislation was passed, and it worked out very well. But because we had a working relationship, we could actually work together and build coalitions of the kind you might not be able to build. And that used to exist in Washington, and it really doesn't exist now for a large variety of reasons. But it really does come down to personal relationships. The one that's always cited is Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan actually extending the life of Social Security by a decade or more. Both gave something. Reagan had to raise Social Security taxes, and O'Neill had to agree to raise the retirement age. But it made a difference, and because they had one of the things that helped was they had a terrific personal rapport. Reagan was so popular among Republicans he could make them buy it, and O'Neill was a really terrific speaker when the speaker had an enormous amount of power, and he could make the Democrats like it, whether they liked it or not, and they got stuff done. And that's really what you have to have, and that's what's, I think, lacking in DC, among other things.
And Dole actually reinforced that.
And
for
Dole
me.
was a terrific inside legislator. He absolutely was
Well,
very
his
skillful.
comment to me when he said, you know, you wouldn't get anything done, and he said, and I'm really sad about that. He said, you know, I used to consider the Democrats my friends.
His chief of staff was a Democrat.
Yeah, he said, George Mitchell and I still talk.
And I think that there's an acknowledgement that there was a time
Yep.
when this happened, and that's how things happened. But now it seems that both parties are sustaining themselves by pointing out how terrible the other party is. So my question again, and Danny, you can take a shot at this now, is what is it? I mean, how is the Republican Party? What are you folks going to be able to do to solve problems? And if you can't solve problems, do you really have a future?
Yeah, look, I just think that you're going to continue to see kind of this pendulum swing from one to the other, and back and forth, if these problems don't get solved, right? As people look for a solution to some of these big issues that we have in front of us. And at a certain point, the consequences of inaction are going to rise to such a degree. Some of the things that Jackie's talked about may lend themselves to some formation of a formidable third party, if you will, in our kind of political world. But we've seen sea changes. I mean, Barack Obama was very different than George W. Bush, and Donald Trump is very different than Barack Obama. So you've seen the pendulum move one way and move back another, and that's going to continue to happen. Majorities are going to shift. Margins are going to be thin between, you know, the majority and minority party in these bodies, and our problems are going to continue to do this. And at a certain point, the citizenry, who's in charge of this whole show, is going to decide, you know what, these two guys aren't getting it done, or these two gals aren't getting it done, and we need to think about how else we organize. Ultimately, it's the consequences of action or inaction that will, I think, produce something other than the intractability that we have today.
Beth, do you think there's a context for this to actually happen?
Possibly. I mean, I think getting back to your actual question about there is this real divide in this country, and I think the numbers bear it out, that there are many people who go throughout their entire days, weeks, months, and never engage anyone of a different perspective. And that's a problem, and it's behavior that they're modeling from elites, right? It's not as if, Trump and Pelosi, despite being friends now, are actually having dinner together and without cameras and, engaging each other in really vivid debates. That's not happening at the elite level, and it's increasingly not happening at the mass level. And without that disagreement in your social networks and your personal networks, it makes people less prepared for those disagreements that have to happen for us to solve big political problems. So until people are willing to accept that disagreement doesn't mean war, it just means disagreement, we're not going to solve any of these problems. And I think we're going to end up with further internal strife within parties and certainly polarization between parties.
Well, and I think the two most important things that we've established tonight is that both Danny Diaz and Howard Dean are really independents.
I'm situated right in the middle of the panel.
Independents. And I think that's wonderful. In 2012, when Barack Obama was running against Mitt Romney, I had a friend come to me, very smart guy, ran one of our businesses, and he said, I bet you Mitt Romney beats Barack Obama by 7 points in the popular vote. We bet dinner with my wife and I and his wife at the Plaza 3. And I said, I'm happy to take that bet, but tell me why. And he said, because everybody I'm talking to, everybody I run into is voting for Mitt Romney. And I think that's endemic of the problem. The other issue we have, and I describe the Democratic and Republican parties as the two worst consumer brands in the world for one very simple reason. They're defined exclusively by negative advertising. It's like if Coke and Pepsi did that. Coke said Pepsi makes your hair fall out. Pepsi said Coke makes you 3 inches shorter, no one would drink Coke or Pepsi. And what it's created is this electorate, the partisans, who actually dislike and hate each other. In fact, in 1960, they did a study. They asked Democrats and Republicans, would you be displeased if your child married someone from the opposite political party? 4% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans said yes. In 2010, they asked that same question. A third of Democrats and 49% of Republicans said yes. And if you look at partisanship levels from 2010 to today, they've only gone up. Partisanship has become the new prejudice. People actually consider the other party a literal threat to America. And in that environment, when you consider the enemy a threat, and we have a system of government that only works with compromise, any compromise becomes a deal with the devil. And so the point that Governor Dean made, that these closed primaries means that if you make a deal with the devil, you're going to get attacked either on your left or on your right, make it almost impossible for problems to be solved.
Okay. Let's go to another question. Nick?
Yes, if there was one question more than any other that people have asked tonight, it is this one, and it comes from Vicky and Sam and Richard, and also from Dave. What are the chances of the US dropping the Electoral College and going to a simple popular vote?
The chances of dropping the Electoral College are very substantial. The chances of going to a simple popular vote are won't be as direct. We're not going to get rid of the Electoral College by constitutional amendment. That's going to almost be impossible. However, there's an effort that's been going on for about 8 or 10 years called the National Popular Vote, where a state like mine, for example, has passed a bill that says at such time that states which control 270 electoral votes pass this bill goes into effect, and it requires the Vermont electors to vote for the person who got the most votes in the United States, not the person who happened to win Vermont. And so if you get 270 states that control 270 electoral votes past that, then the popular vote winner becomes the next president of the United States. Now that's going to have to be tried in the courts because there are people who strongly feel that it's not in their best interest to get rid of the Electoral College. I think the Electoral College is a total disaster. And when an 18-year-old says 2 out of the 4 elections in my lifetime has been going to the person who didn't get the most votes, it just undermines faith in the democratic process. So I think NPV will eventually get enough states to get to 270. Then the next question is, what do the courts have to say about this? And that I'm totally unqualified to comment on.
Next question,
Yes.
Nick.
Did you hear that tap, tap, tapping? That's the friends and neighbors from all over our metro who really didn't have the time to come here tonight, but really wanted to be part of the conversation and are checking in with Colleen Nelson, the head of the editorial board of the Kansas City Star, via live streaming on the Star's Facebook Live page. And the next question comes to you, and who is that question from, and what is it, Colleen?
It is from Julia, and she is tapping on our Facebook Live page. And if you talk about politics long enough, eventually you have to talk about millennials. And she asked, will the number of independents increase as more millennials are able to vote? And if so, will it be the millennials who change the system, or will millennials just conform as generations before them have?
First of all, they're not millennials. They're called first globals. It's the first global generation in the history of the globe. Second of all, they are already mostly independent. They vote for us overwhelmingly because of social issues and climate change. Because they have very high values for diversity. Gay rights is the civil rights issue of their generation, but they're not Democrats. This is our most important age group. They vote for 58% of them voted for Hillary. They elected Barack Obama. It's the only election in my lifetime where more people under 35 voted than over 65. But they're not Democrats because they don't like institutions, particularly political parties, and they think they're clunky. But they have a lot to learn because politics is about institutions and it's about causes that go on longer than your interest does or you do. So the challenge for my party is going to be first of all, to keep these folks interested, because they don't vote down ballot. They don't vote for state legislatures. They just come out and vote for the presidential races and maybe the senator in some states. Until we can do the civics lesson that didn't get done in elementary school and middle school, they're not going to feel any particular compulsion to vote. I think now they do, because Trump's election was essentially a repudiation to the values of the vast majority of people who are young in this country. Again, what do they care about? They care about diversity. They care about climate change. They're pro-immigration. They care about respect for others. They particularly care about women making up their own decisions about health care. They're actually more libertarian than the left wing of the Democratic Party. They don't particularly like unions. They don't like clunky institutions. They think that most government is too big. So the Republicans could get them, but not as long as they're talking about immigration and all this other stuff that they have to crank people up to get them to the polls. So I think they're going to revolutionize politics in this country, but they have to figure out a way that they're comfortable creating their own institutions, which are going to look incredibly different than ours because they're online. They live in a different world than we do in terms of being able to communicate with each other and organize, and mobilize. But they cannot organize beyond an ad hoc, and they're going to have to learn how to do that. Otherwise, they really are not going to be the revolutionary force that I think they will be.
Well, and I would actually say well, number one, given our exit polls in 2014, I really hope they start voting more. Because and I really hope they do get more and more engaged in the political process. We've actually have an interesting phenomenon in Kansas where I think we now have 4 teenagers who have filed to run for governor in Kansas. And I actually think it's a great thing, because if it gets young people more engaged in the political process and turn out and vote, I think it's going to be remarkably positive for the state in general and for young people in general. But I do think they tend to be much more independent.
Can I say something on this too? What you just described, Howard, in terms of that dilemma relative to the fact that young people will tend to vote for Democrats because of an alignment on social issues, but not want to identify with or become party loyalists. I think that presents an interesting problem for your party in the following sense, which is that insofar as the Democratic Party continues to insist that what it means to participate meaningfully is to be a Democrat, is going to limit the extent to which those voters are going to align with the Democratic Party. I mean, we saw this when Obama ran in 2008 in the Democratic primaries, right? It was independent voters, many of whom were young, that gave Obama his margin of victory over Hillary Clinton in 2008. Without a certain number of states allowing independents to vote, Hillary would have been the nominee in 2008, not Barack Obama. Obama then went on to win the general election with a majority of independent voters. But as soon as the election was over, and you must have lived through this from the inside, the Democratic Party insisted that it owned Barack Obama and that anyone who was an Obama supporter had to be a Democrat. And independents, including young people, even young people who supported that social agenda, balked at that. So by the time we got to the re-election campaign in 2012, that coalition that Obama had built between Democrats and independents had very substantially eroded. And I was, among a group of independent leaders who went to Chicago to meet with David Axelrod and the Obama team and say, guys, you have got to find a way to relate in a positive manner to people who consider themselves independents. And we had 8 months of discussion on this, the end product of which was that they came back to us and said, we can't do that because the DNC stakeholders won't allow us, they won't support reaching out to independents in a way that acknowledges who independents are and the kinds of reasons that people become independents, and we can win the election without doing that. They were right that they could win the election, but they lost independent voters by 10 points to Mitt Romney, and in my opinion, that began the slide of independent voters away from the presidential coalition that elected Obama to independents supporting Trump in the last election. Yes, there were a lot of factors for that, but part of it, I think, is that the parties refuse to relate outside of your own constructs. And unless and until you can move beyond that, we're going to be in this highly polarized situation.
Okay, Danny, taking this, I've forgotten that Romney won independence by 10%. You would know that, I'm sure. I don't know whether that's the right number or close to it. Do you see it, this movement away from Democrats because they didn't seize the opportunity in 2008, or do you think it was something else?
Well, I just think we've talked about millennials, we haven't talked about kind of the rise of kind of Hispanics as a greater and greater portion in the electorate. There are a lot of things at play here. And the electorate that you're looking at in 16 is going to be a very different electorate in 24, 28, okay? And this is where, I think like tinkering too much with the process can be dangerous. Because if you're a candidate who's running, you need to appeal to enough of that electorate, 28 or 32 or whatever it is, to be able to get to the majority and win, right? Or to more appropriately hit the magic number in the Electoral College, unless it changes, right? And so I just think there are a lot of things afoot in our politics. I mean, 40%, I think it was Pew in 15 said 39% classified themselves as independents. Well, why doesn't an independent candidate get 40%? Well, because most of them go to vote for Democrats, or most of them go and vote for Republicans. So there's a huge swath of people who do not register with one of the two major parties. That is evidence that they don't necessarily buy into the platform in its entirety, and that they're kind of interested in dating and maybe looking at other candidates. Millennials, Latinos, there's a lot going on within this electorate, and it's going to continue to develop and evolve and change. And if you want to win, you're going to have to figure it out and appeal to it. And so I just think that's the process, and we should respect the process, and we should figure out how to achieve victory kind of within the process.
Okay. Nick?
Yes, Lisa is still absolutely horrified by Greg Orman's statistics about how many Democrats were marrying Republicans and Republicans Democrats. In fact, I found her at the back of the room sobbing uncontrollably. Her tear-stained question is here. Regardless of electoral reforms, what can candidates, Democrats, Republicans, and independents do to reduce the growing hatred Americans have for each other on opposite sides?
Teach civics in every classroom, and have people understand the history of our country, where we've come from, and understand the process. There's zero context. Everything is in the moment and what's happening today. And I think we've done a disservice to our kids and to our system, because people are operating with no depth with regard to where our country is, what's happened, and how we've gotten here, to be very candid with you.
Just to move for a second to make that point, with my classes, I always point out to them that in 1964, when the Civil Rights Bill passed, a higher percentage of Republicans voted for it than Democrats. And they all look at me like that couldn't possibly be, but of course it's true. And so, which is to your point.
If you were to tell, I think, the vast majority of kids that the Republican Party was the anti-slavery party in 1860, and Lincoln was the anti-slavery candidate, and there were two Democratic parties, I believe, a Northern Democrats and a Southern Democrat, they would look at you like you're an alien. They wouldn't get it. And so I just think there needs to be a real impetus in making sure that people learn this stuff.
Yeah.
I would say it's more than just sort of this historical context people need. I think people, part of civics education is also teaching that compromise is part of government. And it's hard to teach that lesson when what they see is not that, right? So it's one thing for me to say in a classroom, in order to have successful governance, we have to have compromise, parties have to work together, people within the same party have to work together. The president cannot be tweeting about his own party members in such personal negative ways for there to actually be progress. And that's something that has to come top down as well. It's not just a matter of teaching people that compromise is important, it has to be demonstrated as well. And I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Well, we also have to change the electoral incentives. Not too long ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, a couple of staffers on the Democratic and the Republican side got together and they proposed a civility pledge that they wanted all 50 governors to sign, 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate, that basically said, I won't lie about my opponent, I will engage civilly, etc. They only got 5 out of 585 people to sign it. And so, we have to change the electoral incentives. And I actually detail that in my book, but the argument I would make, and again, I don't want to beat too many drums about the value of political independence, but if you think about negative campaigning in the context of a genuine 3-candidate race, negative campaigning is half as valuable. Because if I run a negative ad against Danny, and I happen to be running against Danny and Jackie, it's Jackie who's the beneficiary of that ad. Because it knocks Danny down, some people it knocks me down a little bit, but it doesn't do anything to affect Jackie. And so, in some senses, if we had a credible third candidate in every race, it would knock the value of negative advertising in half. Now, some people might say, well, negative advertising is so much better than positive advertising that it just lead to twice as much negative advertising. And there may be an argument for that, but the reality is it would change the electoral dynamic.
Actually, I want to go to Danny and then Howard, but before that, I've got some statistics. In 2000, the number of positive ads were 45%. 35% were called contrast, 20% negative. 2016, 23% were positive, 25% contrast, which I always thought was sort of a euphemism for negative, and 52% negative.
And that's probably all broadcast. That's not even measuring the digital.
Probably, right. So Danny, you're in the business.
Look, I think negative politics is our history. I mean, Adams, Jefferson, very negative. Adams, Jackson, very negative. I get the deployment tools are different now, right? They're so omnipresent that it seems like it's all consuming, and it very well may be, but this isn't anything new. I mean, negative campaigning is part of the way our country has operated for 200 plus years.
Howard, you want to say?
I'd make 2 points. The first is that the point about having multiple candidates in the race, decreasing the value of negative ads is really a big deal. San Francisco was the first city that I'm aware of, certainly the first major city that went to instant runoff voting. They had 18 people, that being San Francisco, in running for mayor. The nature of this is it's important for you to get the second place vote if you're not going to get the first place vote, because the way that it works is the bottom person drops out and their votes are redistributed by computer, so you don't actually, that's why it's called instant runoff voting. The top 4 candidates were actually doing fundraisers for the bottom 4 candidates because they wanted to incur goodwill. And if the 3 of us are running, or all of us on this stage, if I say something terrible about Allan, well, I'm not going to do that because I want his supporters to vote for me second. And if I say something awful about him, that's not going to happen. So multiple fields in instant runoff voting is a great way to eliminate negative campaigning because it becomes a huge disincentive. The other thing is nobody's talked about, which is controversial, but I think we got to get the money out of politics. We have to have real campaign finance reform, because what we have now is billionaires doing this kind of stuff. And, negative advertising may be, tradition, an American tradition, but it's a really crappy one, because after you win, you now have alienated half the people. I mean, it's not, look, I'm a friend of Hillary Clinton's and a good friend of Hillary Clinton's. I mean, you may want to know why I don't want my daughter to marry a Republican, because of what they did to my friend. Now, there's, at some level, everybody feels like this, right? I mean, everybody is going to have somebody, or somebody's going to say something awful. I actually think that the human spirit is such that positivity works better for everybody, but our politics is not positive. It does work well in the short term, but in the long term, I think it's destroying the country. The way to stop that is, one, to have instant runoff voting so there's direct consequences to the people who run the negative ads, and two, to get rid of the billions and billions of dollars that people can put in and have a reasonable limit. You know, Ronald Reagan ran a 50-state campaign and won 49 states for the huge amount of money, $48 million. Now, even after inflation, that is a tiny amount of money compared to what was just spent in the last race, which is something like $2 or $3 billion. I think we really got to have fundamental change. And you know who's willing to do that? The public, both conservatives and liberals. In Arizona, they voted in a public financing of campaigns. It's not exactly a flamingly liberal state. The Chamber of Commerce and the labor unions got together, two big interest groups, one on each side, and put a ballot measure on to get rid of public financing of campaigns. They were overwhelmingly defeated by the average voters in Arizona, and not until the Supreme Court decided that Citizens United was a wonderful idea did they decide that Arizona couldn't use their system. This is a conservative state where liberals and conservatives both agreed that government needs to be reined in and the rules need to be fair. And as long as the rules are crappy, we're in trouble as a country. We got to change that.
So, you know, we passed McCain-Feingold, and it was going to fix all of this.
It did.
And what was the consequences of it? We took money out of the party committees, right, who have to put their name on stuff. They have to own what they say. And now third-party groups are, you know, heavily involved in these races.
That's
right?
what Citizens United, though.
Yeah, to be clear, I mean, the Supreme Court struck down almost every reasonable provision in McCain-Feingold. So the impetus of it really
McCain-Feingold
faded.
was the impetus for the system, the campaign finance system we have today. Why would we take responsibility away from the candidates and the parties? Why wouldn't we heighten the responsibility for the candidates and the parties? Why wouldn't we heighten transparency to ensure that when a campaign contribution comes in, within very short order, it's made publicly available so people can see it, digest it, decide for themselves? And, you know, I've been involved in the last 4 presidential campaigns, and the numbers are big, but, you know, paid politics is much more impactful at a state level. A governor's race, a Senate race, a House race. Presidential campaigns are earned media contests because of the amount of attention every minute of every day. It is the campaign that's run, it's the message that is emoted. That's what has an impact. And, you know, you had Barack Obama, 2008, who people were like, well, my God, this guy's 2 years removed from being a state senator. How is he going to be president of the United States? And probably the biggest thing he did to help himself was run a really good campaign. And people were like, well, I mean, I don't know, you ran a pretty good campaign, maybe he can be president, right? So, like, the campaign matters. And I just think we have to look at presidential politics a little different than state politics, because people are more liked at a state level. Money plays a different role than it does on a national level, to be very candid with you.
Nick, you have another question?
Yeah, a lot of people actually blaming social media for the divisiveness and hatred we see today, but we are constructively engaging social media tonight, thanks to the Kansas City Star and Facebook Live. And the next question from the audience coming outside of the World War I Museum tonight, Colleen Nelson, is what?
Lots of good feedback from the audience outside the World War I Museum, including folks watching in Pittsburgh and North Carolina. So feedback from across the country. Scott would like to know whether you think an independent administration would depoliticize the judiciary, and would an independent administration limit the role of political patronage in appointments?
I think that's actually a great question, and the governor of Alaska right now, Bill Walker, is an independent, and I've actually asked him that question directly. And his comment was pretty telling. He said, you know, I was the first governor of Alaska who actually got to go out and recruit the best and the brightest to serve the state of Alaska. I didn't have to limit myself to people who were politically aligned with one party or the other. I could just find the best person to run the university system and the best person to run the child welfare system. Obviously, in a state like Kansas, we understand after 70 kids in foster care went missing, you know, how important it is to have really good people in those roles. He also said, you know, we're facing one of the biggest issues that Alaska has ever faced, which was a $4 billion budget deficit because of the decline in oil revenues from Prudhoe Bay. And he said, I was able to go and put together a coalition of Democrats and Republicans to solve that issue, that I think it would have been incredibly hard for one party or the other to have to own that solution on its own, because we had to do something that's considered the third rail of Alaskan politics. We had to cut the dividend. And it's something that had never been done before. So I actually think there's real advantages to depoliticizing that process. Now, with that said, any governor can say, we're going to get the best and the brightest. But the reality is, if you look at the history, oftentimes there is a lot of political appointments that get made there.
Okay, so I'm going to give each one of our panelists here about 2 minutes to, we're coming to the end of our program here. I'd like, the topic here was the future of American political parties. So give us in 60 to 120 seconds your projection of what the future is going to look like in terms of political parties in America, in terms of, within the context of what we've been talking about here tonight. So let me start with Beth.
Oh, yay, I get to go first. So I think a lot of it depends on partisan choices. So if, you know, the Republicans figure out a way to work with Trump and get some policy successes, I think that bodes really well for them in the future. If the Democrats can sell a worldview that is different from the Republicans and popular, and within a short amount of time, I think they have a chance long-term, given demographic shifts. And on the Republican side, it's really a question of how to respond to those demographic changes. Howard pointed out that millennials, my students hate that term, by the way, so stop using it. They hate millennials. I don't know why. So I use it all the time in class. But they do tend to be very socially liberal, and that's a problem for the Republican Party. And I think there's a bigger problem looming, which is this demographic shift we're seeing in this country where whites become a demographic minority. And the Republican Party has not figured out a way yet to capitalize on that. And if they don't, I think they become a minority party in a few short years. And the Democrats, of course, have to also sort of sell the worldview that exploits that, or I hate to use that term because it sounds very negative, but really embraces that demographic change more than they have by just saying, well, we like everybody, and so you should vote for us. There has to be a larger message there. So I think there are both partisan choices and larger political forces that will determine the shape of the parties in the future.
Okay, since you mentioned your party, Danny, you get to go next.
Thank you. So I get an additional 30 seconds?
You do. You can have those, yeah, good.
I'm hopeful. You know, I worked in 2010, 2014 on Susana Martinez's race in New Mexico. Haven't won that state since 2004 on a presidential level. She was elected twice. First Hispanic woman in American history elected governor. You know, Brian Sandoval's Republican Hispanic, 2-term governor from Nevada. I don't believe that our identity should define kind of who we are and what we do. I got teenage kids, and I'm very hopeful about the future. I think they see the world differently and frankly better than a lot of us do. And our politics is such, and the participation is such, I think, in the future, as was mentioned before, that people are going to have to appeal to, in a different fashion, to the country, and they're going to have to be smart about the tools that they use, just as, you know, that's continued to evolve. But, you know, as the stakes increase, as I said earlier, I think the need for people in elected office that can get something done, and people that can appeal to a wider swath of the country is going to become more and more premium. So, you know, I expect that and hope that we'll see it.
Okay, Jackie.
In the course of litigating in a number of different states on the question of open primaries, one of the things that happened is that when the parties opposed efforts to open the primaries and allow independents to vote, they argued that they were private associations, and as such, they had the protection of the First Amendment, and they could determine who could and couldn't be permitted to vote in their primary elections. This was their legal argument to the court. And it's a very interesting, and it's a bona fide argument, but for the fact that the taxpayers fund the primaries, and consequently, those primaries are actually quasi-governmental public activities. So the parties were really trying to have their cake and eat it too. I think that the future of America's political parties, for them to play a healthy role, is going to require stepping back from having usurped a kind of governmental role. Political parties are political organizations. They are protected under the First Amendment. They allow freedom of association. People with like-minded views can gather together and use political parties as an instrument for advancing and advocating for their issues. That's a good thing. But insofar as the parties have positioned themselves as controlling the mechanisms of government and the electoral process itself, it has become very, very unhealthy and has contributed to, I think, the rise of partisanship, dysfunction, and distrust. So I think that for parties to play a vibrant role, and I think there should be many parties, not just two, we're going to have to recast the way parties operate and how they function. And they need to be accountable to the public, but they also need to be distinctive from the public. And the public interest needs to be protected as part of how we redesign and re-engineer.
Okay, thank you. Greg?
Well, first, Ambassador Katz, thanks for having me here tonight. It's been actually a great opportunity to talk to people, and I always learn something when I talk to people from different political parties, so I appreciate it. I also want to thank everyone for being here, particularly my wife, Sybil, who's now in her 8th month of pregnancy and probably very uncomfortable after sitting through almost 2 hours tonight. One of the things that struck me tonight is what Danny Diaz said, which is the pendulum will keep swinging, and if we get to the point where these monumental problems are not solved by the two-party system, that there is a high likelihood that something else will come in its place. And so my vision for the future of where politics is going to go in the two-party system in America is really dependent on whether or not the two-party system starts solving the genuine problems that American people have. You know, last election was an anomaly in a sense, but in another sense it wasn't, which is if you look at voter alienation numbers, they have been growing for decades. And one of the things that caught the media by surprise was when they went to New Hampshire and they talked to voters and they said, who are you going to vote for in the presidential contest? And New Hampshire is a place that allows independents to vote. And someone said, well, you know, I think I might vote for Trump. Well, if you don't vote for Trump, who are you going to vote for? Well, I'm probably going to vote for the old guy. Well, you mean George Pataki? No, the old guy. You mean John Kasich? No, the Bernie guy. The Bernie guy. And what the press didn't understand was how a voter could choose between a Democrat and a Republican. But the thing that connects the Tea Party movement to the Occupy Wall Street movement is this belief that Washington is a rigged game that only benefits those people who can buy access to power. And you know what? They're right. You know, Princeton University and Northwestern studied this in 2014. They looked at 1,779 policy issues, and they found that when you control for the interests of the economic elite, the interest of the average American has a statistically significant near zero impact on public policy. So if the two-party system continues to ignore the genuine needs of the American people, it will create a vacuum and something will fill that vacuum.
Thank you. And so The last word is to my oldest friend on this panel, Howard. Go ahead.
Excuse me, you're talking about my age and the
No,
length of the
no,
friendship?
well, both. No.
Thank you, thank you. I actually, this is an incredibly dynamic society that we live in. I'm a perennial optimist, partly because you really have no choice when you get to be my age, Alan, you'll find out. I actually think these problems are already in the process of being fixed, but it's a little like an earthquake. The plate has to move, and it's moving in both parties. I think that the Republicans are going to have to figure out how to overcome their very white, elderly group that sustains them all the time, because that's not what the demographics of the country are going to look like. And in order to do that, they're going to have to start focusing away from their very conservative views on social issues and start talking about economics, which is their strength with young people. I think our party's got a very different problem. Our problem is Will Rogers was right. He doesn't belong to any organized party. He's a Democrat. And we're all over the place. And the truth is there's a huge disconnect between Democrats in Washington and Democrats elsewhere. The Republicans, I think, are much, much more disciplined, although that goes back and forth, and when one group is successful, they copy what the other group did and so forth. We keep copying from each other. But I do think that the first global generation is already resculpting the Democratic Party without being in it, because they so consistently vote for us and provide us all the energy. What I'm involved in an effort now that's funding not the DNC, but Indivisible and Run for Something, Flippable, all these group of Emerge is another one, which trains women candidates, and 39% of their candidates are people of color. I mean, that's our party. That's what our party looks like. We better be doing that, but that's not happening in Washington. But it is happening. The problem is, as I said before, these kids aren't necessarily Democrats. So instead of them joining the DNC is going to have to reconfigure itself or else disappear and end up joining these kids. And I think that I don't know who I'm going to endorse for president, but the person's going to be under 50, or at worst under 55. But at least before the convention. Obviously, I'm going to support whoever the convention nominates. I really think if you want to appeal to a group of people, you have to look like them. And the only way I know how to do that is to look at our most important generation, age-wise, and look like them, which means lots of diversity, lots of young people. I don't want to be on an organization with a board of directors where everybody's in their 60s if it's supposedly doing something for youth, because the young people are going to look at that and go, what? So I think we're already being resculpted. Just the Washington folks have no idea how to handle it, and to be honest with you, I don't either, but I have some idea what these young people are like, so I'm pretty confident we can do it.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank our roving reporters. I want to thank our fact checkers again. Oh, we have a fact, okay.
Yeah, we can't hear me.
Okay, can we get a microphone over there? Oh, that would be good.
I'm racing over there right now. I've already lost 2 pant sizes, ladies and gentlemen, since we started this evening.
Thank you. Okay, real quick. Just one fact. 59% of Americans believe that all or most candidates deliberately twist the truth, and 87% are concerned about the level of personal attacks in political campaigns. We checked you all night. We couldn't find that you twisted anything. Just wanted to end on that.
Okay. Well, I think that tonight hopefully has been enlightening for everybody here. I want to thank also our, what we do is every time we have one of these, we mentioned the civility bells. I've forgotten the opening thing. But we believe that we've been passing out civility bells to all of our panel members and to our sponsors, which we will do right now. Come forward and you give them and the idea is you will have a bell with your name on it. We hope you'll keep it in your office. If it gets a little loud or raucous, hit the bell, and then everybody can count down. We also have them for Cipriana Sipchowitz and Jerry White and Carl Zobrist. Also, we have one for Colleen Nelson from the Star and Laura Vogt for the museum. The only reason the McClarneys don't have one is they already have one from a different event that they were kind enough to sponsor. And again, I want to thank all of our sponsors, our host of World War I Museum, Kansas City Star, our first experiment with live Facebooking. I'm not even sure I know what that means, but I understand it's important. And so that's good. I want to thank all of our volunteers tonight, as well as the fine staff we have in American Public Square. I want to tell everyone here, you're going to receive in your inbox, to your link for sometime in the next 30 minutes, I'm told, a survey. It's a post-event survey. Some of you filled out the pre-event survey. For those of you, even if you didn't, we'd like you to fill it out. We have 2 events coming up, one on the 9th of November. It's called Bad Choices, No Choices, Food Insecurity. It's going to be at UMKC on the 9th of November. And on December 6th, we're launching a series of programs with the Truman Library, where we will have a program entitled NATO Truman to Trump. And it will be on December 6th at the library. More information's in your playbill. Also, if you want to become a member of American Public Square to keep these things happening, outside you can join tonight. You get all kinds of special deals if you join tonight. And finally, because I think this has been an interesting conversation, I'd like to end this with just reading a short quote from a book written by a man named Bill Bishop called The Big Sort. And it goes like this: in a country that is dividing by economic prospects, by years of education, by the look and feel of what constitutes a family, and by political persuasion, we continue to believe there might be a more important message that we all need to hear. The message people living in a democracy must understand more than any other message is that there are Americans who are not just like you. They don't live like you, they don't have families like yours, and they don't think like you. They may not live in your neighborhood, but this is their country too. Thank you all very much for coming.